When you take too much salt or when you take too much sugar, this is going to be absorbed into the bloodstream. What happens to the blood osmolarity? The blood osmolarity is going to become high, meaning that the blood is going to become super concentrated. What happens when a cell is put in a solution which is hypertonic? This cell is going to start losing water to the outside environment, which is having too much salt, and this cell is going to end up shrinking. But does that one happen in the normal sense of the body? It doesn't happen because the body has that ability to maintain homeostasis. How does this one happen? When the blood becomes too hyperosmolar, so the blood vessels which are going to be passing around a very important structure which we are calling the hypothalamus, we have sensors there which we call the osmoreceptors. These osmoreceptors, they are going to sense the osmolarity of blood that the blood is becoming too much concentrated. What happens? These osmoreceptors are going to become activated and they send signals to the hypothalamus, the neuron cell bodies in the hypothalamus. They will get the message and say, the blood is becoming too much concentrated. What happens is gene expression happens, and when you talk of a gene expression, you're going to be making a messenger RNA. Messenger RNA will leave the nucleus via the nuclear pores into the cytoplasm, and that process is what we call transcription. Now, the messenger RNA carrying the instructions for a particular protein to be made is going to get translated by the ribosomes into a protein which we want. And this protein is what we call the ADH. The ADH, through what we call axonal transport, is going to be moving down the axon into what we call, that's going to be terminating into what we call the posterior pituitary gland, whereby our posterior pituitary gland will now going to release the ADH into blood, and then the ADH will circulate down to our kidneys, and of course directly into the collecting duct. It will lead, ADH will lead into insertion of what we call the aquaporins, which will increase more of the absorption of water into the blood. When that one happens, it means the blood is going to start now coming back into the normal range of what we call the osmolarity. Okay, because at first it was too concentrated, but because of the effect of the ADH, more water is getting reabsorbed by the kidneys back into the blood, making the blood to become a bit slightly dilute, which will bring back the osmolarity back to range between 275 and 295 millimoles per liter. Okay, that is going to be now the normal osmolarity of blood in a normal sense, and homeostasis, we say, to have been achieved. Okay, my name is Tumnad, and today's lecture we are going to be focusing on what we call the brain mid-sagittal section. We are going to be looking at all those structures that can be seen if you cut the brain into two hemispheres and you're looking it from the middle side. That's what we call the mid-sagittal section of the brain. Okay. Please, but if you have not yet subscribed to this channel, please make sure you subscribe. You turn on the notification bell so that whenever I load the video, you don't miss out. You get notified and start watching the video. Okay, let's start with the mid-sagittal section of the brain. So here you are seeing is a mid-sagittal section of the brain. We are going to be seeing very many different structures. Okay, but some structures I'll just be mentioning them because I don't want to congest this diagrammatic illustration such that every body part is seen. Okay, now this one here is showing us actually showing what we call the central nervous system, which is going to be having the brain, and then I've just drawn a very small portion of the spinal cord. Okay, so now we are going to start by labeling some of these parts, and again so I'll be talking about some of the functions that's going to be played by some of those parts. Okay. Okay, now starting from this side, let's start from this side. Now, but before that, we need to first now understand these lobes, okay? Because we said that the cerebral cortex or the cerebellum is divided into different lobes and has a minimum of mainly 4 types of lobes. However much we have the 5th one, which is less talked about, which you call the insula, okay? So now these green labels are showing the lobes. Okay, so you're going to start first by labeling these lobes, and then finally we shall look some of those parts which are going to be located in those lobes. Okay, now this part, the lobe which is going to be located at the back, this is what we call the occipital lobe. Okay, this is what we call the occipital is what we call the occipital lobe, okay? And then next to the occipital lobe is what we call the parietal lobe, which is going to be separated by what we call parieto-occipital fissure or parieto-occipital sulcus. So our part B is what we call the parietal lobe, okay? Then going in front, which we are calling this lobe, which is C, this is going to be now the front part. And the fact that is the front part, it is just called the frontal lobe. Okay? It is just called the frontal lobe. Okay? And the parietal lobe is separated from the frontal lobe by this kind of very important feature which we call the central sulcus. Okay? But when we come to the lateral sides, towards the temporal side, we have this kind of lobe which we are labeled D, and this kind of lobe is what we call the temporal lobe. Okay, is what we call the temporal lobe. So now generally those are the 4 lobes that make up what we call the cerebellum. However, don't forget about the 5th one, which is called the insula, that's going to be having some of the gustatory functions. Okay, now starting to label some of these parts, let us label them anatomically and see where they're going to be located and some of the associated structures which are going to be nearby those areas. Okay, now when you see this structure here, which is green, okay, this structure which is green, how do we call this structure? This structure is what we call corpus callosum. Okay, this structure here is what we call corpus callosum. Okay, corpus callosum. And this corpus callosum is going to be myelinated bundles of the axons, which is going to be now part of what we call the white matter. This corpus callosum is super very important. That's going to be helping in uniting the 2 hemispheres together, okay, connecting the 2 hemispheres together, which is the right and then the left hemispheres together, and of course it's going to be aiding what we call communication between these two hemispheres. This corpus callosum is super very important. Okay, then when you come on top to the top of the corpus callosum, we have that kind of the raised groove, what you call the gyrus. Okay, so now this first kind of gyrus, which is just on top of what we call the corpus callosum, how do we call this? We call it the cingulate gyrus. Okay, we call it the cingulate gyrus. Okay, the cingulate gyrus. And just immediately after the cingulate gyrus, we just have a small depression which you call the sulcus. On that sulcus, which is just immediately after the cingulate gyrus, is what we call the cingulate sulcus. Okay. Now, coming back into the middle of this area, you see the whole of this space? This space is going to be having what we call a very thin membrane in between, okay? A very thin membrane in between. Now, this membrane is going to be separating the 2 kind of ventricles. And how do we call these ventricles? These ventricles are what we call the lateral ventricles. So, in between, you're going to be having this thin membrane. How do we call this membrane? This membrane is what we call septum, septum pellucidum. Okay, septum pellucidum. Okay, and this membrane is going to be now separating portion of what we call the lateral ventricles, because the lateral ventricles, we have one in the right hemisphere and then another in the left hemisphere. Okay, that means we have 2 lateral ventricles. Okay. Now, coming to this kind of structure, which is more like of an egg. You see this structure is like of an egg, part of the diencephalon. You see this structure here is very important in the way that it has the ability to relay sensory and what we call motor functions, with the exception of what we call a sense of smell. So now, this kind of egg-like structure, how do we call this? We call this structure as the thalamus. Okay, this structure is what we call the thalamus. And the thalamus is super very important as a relay station of sensory and motor information. Then just posteriorly to the thalamus, just down this area here, how do we call this kind of small portion just at the back of the thalamus, just inferior to it? They call this area as the pineal body. Okay, they call this area as the pineal The pineal body. And this pineal body is very important in the way that it releases a very important chemical that's going to be regulate our sleep-awake cycle. And how do we call that chemical? That chemical is what we call melatonin. Okay, that hormone is called melatonin. This guy releases melatonin that's going to be regulating our sleep-awake cycle. Super very important. Okay. Now coming down here. Now the thalamus is going to be now making the boundaries of another category of what we call the ventricles. And how do we call that kind of ventricle, which is going to be located in between the thalamus? That kind of ventricle is what we call the third ventricle, and is one. Okay, the third ventricle is going to be located in between what we call the thalamus. Okay, so now the thalamus, or what we call the third ventricle, is going to be secreting what we call cerebrospinal fluid. Now, when you see on the upper part of this structure, these dotted structures, they are the choroid plexus, which are located in the third ventricle. Okay, they are the one responsible for the secretion of what we call cerebrospinal fluid. Now, this cerebrospinal fluid from the third ventricle is going to flow down to the fourth ventricle. You see this one here, just in between the pons and then the cerebellum. This kind of ventricle here is what we call the fourth ventricle. Okay, this one here is what we call the fourth ventricle. Okay. Now, the fourth ventricle is going to be connected to the third ventricle by a very important canal. How do we call this kind of canal that connects the third ventricle to the fourth ventricle? They call this one as a cerebral aqueduct. They call it as cerebral aqueduct. Okay, cerebral aqueduct. Okay, cerebral aqueduct, meaning that it is this kind of connection that connects the fourth ventricle to the third ventricle. Okay, now how about the lateral ventricle getting connected into the third ventricle? There's that kind of connection in between. How do we call that? We call that one as interventricular foramina, or foramen of Monro. Okay, foramen of Monro, connecting the third ventricle to the lateral ventricles. Super important things. Okay. Now, how do we call the whole of this structure? The whole of this structure here, which is going to be coordinating movements and ensuring balance. The whole of this structure here is what we call the cerebellum. Okay, is what we call cerebellum. Super very important. People who take alcohol, you know what happens when that structure is depressed. You cannot have the sense of balance. You keep staggering and you even end up collapsing. Okay? Now, we have this kind of very tiny kind of cells, the plexus here, which is going to be secreting cerebrospinal fluid to the fourth ventricle. You see, every kind of ventricle has what we call plexuses, which is responsible for secretion of cerebrospinal fluid. So now this one here is going to be the choroid. It's going to be the choroid plexus of the fourth ventricle. Okay, or the fourth ventricle. We shall come later and extract all the ventricles individually, and we see one by one. But what we need to know that we have 4 ventricles, whereby we have the 2 laterals, and the 1 third ventricle, and then 1 fourth ventricle, making up a total of 4 ventricles, each of them having individual plexuses that is going to be secreting cerebrospinal fluid. Okay. Then from the fourth ventricle, we have a very important canal, which we call the central canal of the spinal cord, which is going to be flowing the cerebrospinal fluid down throughout the spinal cord. So now the whole of this structure here, which is shaded green, is what we call the spinal cord. Okay. So what we call the spinal cord. The spinal cord is super very important. So I'll have an individual video talking about the spinal cord and all that. Okay. Now, coming this structure here, the whole of this structure for this and this and this makes what we call the brain stem. But now the topmost part of the brain stem, we have this structure here. This structure here is what we call the midbrain. Now, when you come to the midbrain, we just have at the back of the midbrain, we have two kinds of elevations. This kind of two elevations, we have what we call the superior and then inferior colliculi. These structures are super very important because they are going to be regulating what we call the visual and then the auditory reflexes. And these are going to be our levels of exit points of what we call the cranial nerve number 3 and then cranial nerve number 4, because cranial nerve number 3 is going to be passing on what we call the superior colliculi, and then our cranial nerve number 4, which is called the trochlea, which is going to be exiting from the posterior part of the brainstem and then coming to the level what we call the inferior colliculi, and then it exits and it goes supply what we call the ocular muscles, which we call the superior oblique. Okay. So now this brainstem, at the back of it, we have those kind of structures which are super very important. Then just next to this pineal gland, we have this kind of very, very, very important structure. And this structure is going to be connecting the two sides of what we call the midbrain. How do we call this structure here, which is in green? This structure is what we call the posterior commissura, okay? Is what we call the posterior commissura. Okay, now it is now this kind here in front part towards the temporal part. We also have what we call the anterior commissura, which is going to be uniting mainly what we call the temporal lobes of the different hemispheres. Very, very important. Okay. Now coming back to the front part. This front part is super very important. Now, how do we call this kind of band of axons which are myelinated, just superior to what we call the thalamus? How do we call this kind of structure here? They call this structure as what we call the fornix. Okay, this structure is what we call the fornix. Okay, is what we call the fornix. Okay, it is very, very, very important. Band of what we call the myelinated, which is going to be part of the white matter. Okay, then in our egg-like structure, which we call the thalamus, we still have another kind of a small raised structure. This structure, which I have just labeled black. How do we call that structure? That structure is what we call interthalamic adhesions. It is trying to make sure that the thalamus are going to be now connected together by this structure, which we are calling the interthalamic adhesion. It's super very important. Okay, so now we have said that this structure, which is just on top of the thalamus, is what we call the fornix. Then how do we call the whole of this space here? The whole of this space here. The whole of this space here is what we call the hypothalamus. Okay, this space here is what we call the hypothalamus. Okay, the hypothalamus is super very important in regulating a lot of autonomic functions, because we have the anterior portion and then the posterior portion, which are going to be the exit points of the activation of what we call the sympathetic and then parasympathetic nervous system, which collectively make what we call the autonomic nervous system. And of course, it's going to be regulating what we call temperature, because it has what we call the thermostat, which is when regulated, leading to regulation of what we call temperature. And of course, there are very many other homeostatic functions of what we call the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is super very important, and we talked about it when we were talking about the osmolarity of blood at the beginning, that is going to be responsible for the secretion of what we call the ADH, which will move down the axon terminal in what we call the pituitary gland before it is released in blood to go and cause the absorption of water in the kidneys. Okay. And when we come to this area here, you see this area here. This is what called the anterior commissura, and then just we have this kind of the bulbar structure. Okay, this kind of bulbar structure. This kind of bulbar structure, we have two of them, and they come and then they cross one another before they go into their independent cortex. Okay, how do we call the whole of this structure? This structure is what we call optic chiasm. Okay, this structure is what we call the optic chiasm. Okay, what we call the optic chiasm, and it's going to be part of the second cranial nerve, which we are calling the optic nerve. Okay, it goes and then crosses one another at what we call optic chiasm. Okay. Now, down from the hypothalamus, This kind of canal which is now connecting to the hypothalamus, how do we call this area? This kind of connection to this kind of dark structure, how do we call that area? We call that area as the infundibulum. Okay, how do we call this area? What we call the infundibulum. And then how do we call these dark structures? They are to have two portions. This structure is what we call the pituitary gland. Okay, is what we call the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland can also be called, you may find some other people calling it what we call the master gland, or you may even find some people calling it the hypophysis, okay, or what we call the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is very, very, very important, playing a role in what we call endocrine, releasing a lot of hormones like the ADH, the FHH. There are a lot of hormones which are going to be released by this guy called the pituitary gland, in serving a lot of homeostatic laws, controlling what we call the menstrual cycle, and a lot. This guy is going to be containing two portions: the posterior pituitary gland, which is going to be housing the ADH and then oxytocin, and then the anterior pituitary gland is going to be housing a lot. For example, it's going to be housing what we call the FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, and a lot of hormones, the prolactin hormone, the estrogen, progesterone. All those hormones are going to be located in that portion, what we call the anterior pituitary gland. Okay, super very important. Now, just anterior to the midbrain, we have this kind of structure here, which is super very important. How do we call the whole of this structure here? This structure here is what we call the mammillary body. Okay, this structure here is what we call the mammillary body. This structure coming here is what we call the mammillary body. Very, very, very important structure. We shall look at it individually in great detail. Okay. Then how do we call this kind of the protrusion? This kind of protrusion, which is part of the brainstem, super very important. This structure here, this structure is what we call the pons. Okay. This structure here is what we call the pons. Okay, and the pons is super very, very important. How important is it? It's going to be having the nucleus, which is going to be now responsible for what you call adjustment, what you call respiration. Okay, and this pons is going to be helping us in origin, having a lot of the nucleus, which are going to be having most of the cranial nerves are going to be exiting from this what we call the pons. We have a lot of the cranial nerves which are going to be exiting from what we call the pons. What are those cranial nerves which are going to be exiting from these pons? We have cranial nerve number 5, which we call the trigeminal nerve. Okay, the trigeminal nerve. Cranial nerve number 6, which we call the abducens. Cranial nerve number 7, which we call the facial nerve, and then cranial nerve number 8, which we call the vestibulocochlear or the auditory nerve. All of them are going to be exiting on this structure, which we are calling the pons. Okay, so this pons is very, 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 very important. Okay, and it's going to be having a lot of nucleuses. Okay, we have a lot of nucleuses which are going to be residing in what we call the pons. Okay, so now we have this kind from the pons just down to it, the inferior part of the pons is going to be connected to this kind of structure, which is very important. How do we call this structure? They call this structure as the medulla. They call it as the medulla oblongata. Okay, the medulla oblongata, and this medulla oblongata is very important. It is very important in the regulation of what we call autonomic body functions. There are a lot of functions of this medulla oblongata regulates even without our awareness. Okay, for example, we do not have consciousness. We are not conscious of what's going to be happening with heart rate. We are not conscious of what we call the blood pressure. We are not conscious with what we call the dilatation and then the constriction of what we call the smooth muscles and then the cardiac muscles. So all those kind of automatic functions are going to be regulated by what we call some part of what we call the medulla oblongata. Okay, we have said the autonomic functions, the heart rate, what we call the blood pressure. We also have the GI motility, for example, because it has a nucleus called the dorsal nucleus vagus, which is going to be giving out the parasympathetic fibers, which is going to be part of the cranial nerve number 10, which is the vagus nerve, to go and innervate into the GIT, leading into GI motility, and then also GI secretion enhancement. In conjunction is what we call the enteric nervous system. Okay, so now the medulla oblongata is a super very important. And then the medulla oblongata is going to be also an exit point of different cranial nerves. What are some of those cranial nerves that are going to be exiting from what we call the medulla oblongata? We have cranial nerve number 9, which is glossopharyngeal, and then cranial nerve number 10, which is the big man, called the vagus nerve, and then also have cranial nerve number 11, which is the accessory nerve, and then in between the pyramid and the olive, okay, this kind of the cranial nerve is going to be coming from what we call the pyramid. There's that kind of junction between the pyramid and then the olive. We have that kind of cranial nerve, which you call cranial nerve number 12, which is going to be hypoglossal nerve, which is going to move all along and supply the muscles of the tongue. Okay, it's going to be regulating tongue movement. Okay, so the medulla oblongata is also super very important. Okay. We have seen all that, so let's just have a very quick recap of what we have just talked about. We said that this is going to be a sagittal section of the brain, which is going to be showing us some of the structures inside, and then of course at the other lateral side, you're going to be having these kind of lobes. We said that lobe head at the back is what we call the occipital lobe. Then above it is going to be now the parietal lobe, separated by what we call the parieto-occipital lobe, and then the front lobe is what we call the frontal lobe, and then we have this lateral side towards the temporal bone. The part, this is what we call the temporal lobe. And we also talked that we have also another kind of lobe, which is let's talked about, which we call the insular lobe, having what we call the gustatory functions. We went ahead and said that this kind of the gyrus, which is just above what we call the corpus callosum, we said is what we call the singlet gyrus, and then this kind of the band of axon, which is myelinated, which appears white, is what we call the corpus callosum, that connects the two hemispheres together. And then we said the membrane, which is going to be in between this place here, which is going to be in between the lateral ventricles, we said it's what we call the septum pellucidum. And then we said this kind of the egg-like structure is what we call the thalamus, having a protrusion which we call the interthalamic adhesions. Then we said this structure at the back, which secretes melatonin, which regulates sleep-awake cycle, is what we call the pineal body or the pineal gland. And then we said that in between the thalamus, we have what we call the third ventricle, that's going to be connected to this structure here, which is called the fourth ventricle, by what we call the cerebral aqueduct, which connects these two ventricles. And then we said that this kind of cerebellum, this structure called the cerebellum, we also have some kind of the bundles of the axon which are myelinated in the center, which is going to be part of the white matter, which we call the arbor vitae, the central part of this kind of the white matter axons, what we call the arbor vitae. And then we said that even the fourth ventricle, third ventricle, lateral ventricle, they also have secreting cells or secreting plexuses for the cerebral spinal fluid. We call this one the choroid plexus of the cerebral of the fourth ventricle. We moved ahead and said that this structure just above the thalamus, which is going to be myelinated axons or band of the axons or the fibers, which we call the fornix. And then we said that this structure here is what we call the hypothalamus, which regulates a lot of homeostatic role, regulation of the autonomic functions, the temperature regulation, sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system activation, and all that. And then we move down here, we said that this is going to be the anterior commissure, which is going to be responsible for connecting together what we call the temporal lobe. And then the back here, we have what we call the posterior commissure, okay? Then we said that this area is what we call the infundibulum, that's going down to these black structures, which we are calling the pituitary gland. We say the pituitary gland can also be called the hypophysis and can also be called what we call the master gland. It releases a lot of hormones serving an endocrine neuron. It has two portions, the posterior, which has the ADH and oxytocin, and then the anterior pituitary gland, which houses a lot of hormones, which we just talked about, with an example of what we call the follicle stimulating hormone, okay? And then also talked about that this structure here just in front of the midbrain, which we call the mammillary body, and then this bulbar structure which we call the pons, having a lot of nucleus and having a lot of exit points of what we call the cranial nerves. And then finally we talk about this big man which is connecting down to the spinal cord, which we call the medulla oblongata, having a lot of nucleuses, having the exit point of different cranial nerves as we just talked about. Okay, and we shall be talking about some of these cranial nerves and their exit points in the future coming videos. We shall also talk about these ventricles. We extract the ventricles from the mid part of the cerebellum, and we talk about these ventricles individually. Okay. This covers the anatomy and some little part of the physiology on what we call the brain mid-sagittal section. And if you find this video has been helpful, you have picked up something, please, you can support me. And this can be done in a couple of ways. You like the video, you can comment in the comment section, you can share the video to the people who you think this video is helpful, and don't forget to subscribe at the end of it all. Okay. And this is going to be now my last message for the year 2025. This video has just been made on 31st of December 2025. As I talk right now, it is exactly 20 minutes past 11 p.m. as of where I am standing right now, meaning that we just have less than 40 minutes to close the year 2025 and we close to 2026. I want to say thank you for your support. Thank you for watching my video. Thank you for liking my video, and thank you for everything. It has been to me, Tumnad, from the whole of 2025. We have been together. You have enjoyed my work. Thank you very much. I cannot appreciate enough. But the only way I can say, I just wish you a very wonderful, prosperous New Year 2020-2026. Thank you very much for watching. Tumnad as always. Until we meet next time. Happy New Year to you all. Bye.